Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Thursday, April 27th. When I was in college, I started as a pre-med student and then chose to devote myself to classical studies, but within that classical study program, I chose to focus on ancient history, primarily because I was interested in the study of sacred scripture, and I wanted to understand Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian history. So I wanted to spend a lot of time in ancient history, and I also got into Greek and Roman history, of course, and Hellenistic history, the period of the time of Alexander the Great, intertestamental history. But I really focused on biblical history, and I studied a lot in ancient history, preparing, I thought, for a future in Protestant ministry as a Bible teacher. What's interesting to me is that when I look at what's going on in modern society, I see many parallels between things that I studied in ancient history. And not many people study ancient history, to be honest, and I can understand why, because the studies can get pretty dry, especially when you're dealing with fragmented sources and things like that. It gets quite boring. You have to do a lot of study to glean just a little bit of information, and it's often useless information. But nevertheless, when we look at, let's say, ancient religion or ancient magic or sorcery and ancient religion and so on, ancient laws, we find that there's actually a lot that we can see in modern society, but it's made to appear in a different, a different aspect. It's got a different mode of presentation, I should say. For example, in the ancient world, they were very open, speaking about religion. So there was no problem for a king or for a people to talk about the gods, to talk about religious ideas, to talk about prayer and worship and sacrifices and things like that. That was normal in the ancient world. When people had problems, they often looked to religious or some sort of supernatural source or influence for relief from those problems. And in modern society, after the scientific revolution, men tend to shy away from that kind of talk. Even Christians are uncomfortable in many cases talking about God or prayer or different aspects of the Christian life. There's an awkwardness that's caused by this dominating materialistic mindset that we're all raised on. And it takes a great deal of effort and time to work ourselves out of that and talk about religion and spiritual things in a comfortable way, as people did in the ancient world. So when we look at the modern world, we see many of the same things. If we can look past this superficial appearance of things, we see many of the same things simply spoken of and presented in different ways. And I'll give you an example. Let's take medicine. In the ancient world, it was very, very simple. The people believed that the gods created the world and created different plants, different animals, different stones, different metals, all different sorts of things. They believed that these things were related to the gods, that they had their origin in the design and intentions of the gods. And so if someone was sick or there was a disease going around, they would speak very openly and simply about the desire to find remedies for the problems that were being experienced in natural things. And again, not just herbs or plants, but also in stones, in metals, in incantations, and so on. They sought directly help from nature and from what they considered to be the influences that controlled nature, the gods and goddesses. But they dealt with nature in a direct way. They dealt with plants themselves. They dealt with all sorts of different natural products, whether it's parts of animals' bodies, bones, blood, different fluids from bodies, different bones from animals, plants, flowers, roots, different substances found in flowers, trees, leaves, bark, again, roots, sap, all of these different natural products. They believed that these things were not accidental, but that they were created. All the variety of them was intentional, because they had different powers, they had different purposes and uses, and so men studied to try to learn about what the different uses of these natural things might be. And they had theories about how it could be discovered. One, for example, was they believed that the gods caused different natural things to look like the problems that they helped to solve. And so you can look at a root or a flower or a design on something, and it would resemble in some way the problem that it was designed to remedy. So they had different theories about how to figure stuff like that out. They also did things by trial and error, but over thousands and thousands of years, there was this constant study of natural history, of all of the different plants and animals and stones and so on. And these notes and experiences were recorded by the great natural historians, as I said, for thousands and thousands of years. And they spoke of these things based on experience, and the things that they wrote and talked about were considered to be proven and known for thousands of years, all the way through the Middle Ages and into the modern era. Before the scientific revolution basically took all of that experience, all of those writings, all of those records, and just threw them away when it proposed that we start from scratch in collecting human knowledge by means only of the modern scientific method. And so this tradition of natural observations, of medicinal remedies and experiences and so on was abandoned because it was sort of painted as being obsolete. It was superstitious. It was unscientific. It was backwards and influenced by religion and philosophers and so on. And it was just thrown out, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we lost thousands of years of experience with all of these different substances and natural objects, and the records of their influence on human conditions, on the human body, and many other issues as well. Not just human, but also animals, and gardening and plants and food preservation and everything. We lost all of this knowledge. Thankfully, it still can be found in preserved resources like old books. We can go back and read Pliny's Natural History, for example. We can find records of these things in ancient literature, all through classical literature, in sacred scripture, and so on. We have medieval sources like Dioscorides on plants. We have more modern, like Culpeper, who was an English natural historian. So there's lots of sources on these things. We also have writings of ancient religions and what we would call sorceries or different magical remedies and incantations and things like that, magic potions, magic concoctions that were believed to have different effects. We have records of these things, often not in the English language, but we still have these records, but they need to be dug out from libraries. And thankfully today we have access to digital libraries where we can find these things, and there's a lot of work done to translate them and talk about them and so on. But the way that things were talked about in the ancient world is very different from the way things are talked about today. Now, one of the things that I've noticed over time is that there's a lot of repetition. In other words, the discoveries of the modern natural sciences. It's the same stuff. It's the same plants, same animals, same substances, same human experiences, and so on. And most of the actual findings in modern research simply repeat what was already known before. The problem with modern science is that we relearned things at very great cost. You think about what a modern scientific investigation would cost with all of the modern equipment and just the methods by which testing is done and investigations are pursued. It's a very, very expensive way of investigating the natural world. And like I said, most of the time, the results of these costly investigations are exactly what was already known by the ancients. And so it's a lot of work done in vain, literally reinventing the wheel. We use that phrase to suggest that would be an undesirable thing. Yet that's exactly what most of modern science is doing. And sure, there are innovations and things that have been developed, but even these technological breakthroughs that we brag about, they often are short-lived and unsustainable. They often come at ridiculous, unjustifiable costs, and they end up becoming useless in time. So if you can ignore all of the bells and whistles of the latest and greatest technology and just sort of ignore that as unsustainable stuff that is probably not going to be around in 200 years, and pay attention to the fundamental stuff that is going to endure, the things that the scientific method, if it was used rightly, would actually establish and prove, regardless of the cost of the investigation or the complexity of the technology needed for the testing. If you focus on what you actually have access to evidence for, rather than all of this speculation about what some scientist has observed somewhere, which none of us can verify or provide details for, if we limit our talk about the natural world to what we actually have access to in terms of evidence, we'll find that it's almost exactly the same knowledge that was already possessed in the ancient world. And we'll often find that the ancient world possessed more knowledge because that knowledge had been collected over thousands of years, whereas this modern scientific knowledge has only been collected for a few hundred years. So in many areas, they have even more information than modern science provides. And if you just think about it, if you wanted to know, like, what is the official answer of modern science to any question in the natural sciences, there's no source for that information unless you're going to go start digging through, scholarly journals and things like that. looking for a needle in a haystack. It's really, for all the hype and all the talk, Tucker Carlson actually talked about this recently, that the information age has basically led us to a point where we feel like we know less than ever. Sort of the paradox of this so-called information age. We feel less confident about our knowledge of our own bodies, of ourselves, of the natural world, of plants and animals, and so on. For all the talk of the progress and development, we feel less certain about everything. And that's why modern science normally leads people to what's called agnosticism, a state of mind where you feel like the truth is unknowable. That's what agnosticism is. So there's a lot of modern science talk and all this that needs to be ignored, and there's a lot of people who talk about science and they criticize ancient thought, they criticize philosophy and religion, but they have no evidence for the stuff they talk about. They just repeat things they've heard other people say, and Christians are often intimidated by those people because Christians don't know how to respond, and what they should say is, where is the hard evidence for what you're saying? Because it normally doesn't exist. So anyway, what I'd like to draw attention to is that much of what is known in the modern world was already known in the ancient world. What is done in the modern world was already done in the ancient world, but it was thought of and spoken of and maybe even carried out in a different way. And that causes it to appear to be new or different or innovative. But really it's the same stuff, the same things, just repackaged in this sort of modern appearance. If we look at modern society, just look at the topics in the news, the things that Christian people are stressed out about. Look at things like violence and criminal behavior in our cities. Look at things like this transgender activity, all this talk about transgenderism, transsexuality, all these things. We look at these things and we say, man, this stuff never was around before. This is new. This is end times stuff, and that's completely false. Look at things like alcohol abuse and drug use. The problem with drugs and with the troubles caused by modern medicine. Look at kids being given drugs that affect their mind and their emotions, that change hormones and chemicals in their bodies that are part of a very complex system that's supposedly regulated by the brain, and yet we go into these bodies and we start tinkering with all of these levels of chemicals and substances, and you have to sit back and ask, is there any way that we can do this really that's under control and intelligent, or are we just tampering with things that are far beyond our comprehension with a sort of a reckless arrogance that pretends to know more than we know? And if you look at the results, which you're not allowed to do these days, you're not allowed to judge things by their results. If you look at the results of things, this is not scientific stuff at all. The results are unpredictable. We often hear scientists and physicians explaining away their failures and how things didn't work out the way that they thought they would. The results are spoken of with very little scientific language, whereas the prescriptions and the proposed solutions are spoken of with an air of absolute certainty that really doesn't make any sense. And if we talk about the results, we're immediately attacked as if talking about results is unreasonable. The perfect example of this was COVID. We sat here listening to so-called experts who were given complete control over every aspect of our society, even though they're not elected officials, and we claim to be a democratic society. These people were given complete control over the society, and we had people telling us things that even common sense blue-collar people knew was not scientific, was not certain, and so on. Everyone was complaining about the need to wear masks because it was clear that microscopic viruses are not going to be blocked in any absolute way by the wearing of some cheap cloth mask. People knew that, and yet this talk about the need to wear masks as if they were virus filters was made very clear, and everyone put their masks on because we've been trained to understand that we, the people, are not allowed to question the remedies proposed by the so-called scientists. And you saw a whole nation of people living in a democratic state where they're taught that liberty is a fundamental human right that's protected by our Constitution. They forfeited all of their liberty because the enemy in this case was science, which you don't speak against, you don't contradict science. And so we watched as people injected chemicals into their bodies, put cloth masks over their faces, went into all of these different practices and proposed remedies to try and overcome this invisible disease. And again, if you listen to all of the language and you look at how everything is presented, the people telling you what to do are dressed in lab coats, or they're dressed in jackets and ties, and they've got their little name badges, and they've got stethoscopes around their necks and things like that. And you look at this, and what I think is that this is sort of a priesthood, as it were. If you compare the ancient priests and ancient magicians and healers and soothsayers and magicians and things like, if you were to make a list to describe their qualities and compare that list to the behavior and the behavior of these modern scientists and physicians, you would find that they are very similar. They're very similar. And this is what interests me, because I believe that many of the pre-Christian ancient ideas and practices that were removed from human society by Catholicism in the Christian era are being revived in disguise, as it were. The language used to speak of them is changed. The priests, like I said, are spoken of and dressed differently. The whole arrangement of these different institutions appears different. But if we boil away all of these external appearances and really get down to the essential characteristics of these ancient and modern institutions, I'm always amazed to see how much they have in common. And yet it's all presented differently. So for example, if you look at the ancient world, you'll see that the ancient people, as I said before, worked directly with plants and natural substances. So they might take a flower and dry it out and grind it into a powder. They might mix that powder into a potion, and it might be something that you just eat or drink or add to your food or even smoke. We look at the ways in which they made use of the substances, and it was very simple. When we look at modern medicine, we find that the way that the substances are used is very technical and complicated. So for example, we use a syringe to inject a fluid directly into our bodies, through our skin. Well, the ancients didn't do that. And the reason why they didn't do it is because there was no need to do that. There was no need to do that. They would put things on the surface of the body because they understood that whatever was put on the surface of the body could make its way into and through the skin. They understood that. They didn't put things into a form of a tablet or a pill because they understood that you could simply eat them and it does the same thing. It doesn't have to be in the form of a pill or a capsule. They didn't create liquids and inject them intravenously or intramuscularly as we do with syringes today. They would simply drink them as potions or fluids, mixed in a fluid that could be drunk. And they handled the substances in a different way than we do today, and that causes us to think that we're doing something different, and we're really not doing anything different. We're just doing the same things in a way that's superficially different, but not essentially different. And again, we have this idea that we're doing something really innovative and unprecedented. But it's the same thing. Even when we talk about the substances that we use, one thing that I like to do is whenever I hear the name of a medication, I like to look at the history of that medication. I like to look into where that medication came from, how it was discovered, how it was originally discovered. So for example, today I was thinking of the fact that my daughter Elizabeth, my oldest daughter, she had a terrible seizure when she was 3 years old. Terrible, life-threatening seizure. She was in seizure for up to 2.5 hours. And she was receiving all of this medication because the paramedics were trying to save her life at that point. And my wife and I was at work, my wife was home. My wife just sort of yielded to the first responders, and they were doing everything they could just to get the seizures to stop. And then after that initial treatment, she was stabilized, thank God, and we were then sent to see a neurologist to have her, I think it was a neurologist, to have her evaluated after that event. And I remembered that the prescription that she was given was phenobarbital. I think that's what it's called, phenobarbital. So you can look up and find out, like, where did this medication actually come from? Where did this it's a barbiturate. Where did these barbiturates come from? How are they developed, and so on? And you can dig in and you can find histories of the research and development of these different drugs and where they came from and how they were used and so on. And you can do that for all kinds of different medications. And it's very interesting to see where they came from, because we often find that there was something very simple. There was something simple, like there was this, I'll give an example with, let's take steroids, anabolic steroids, for example. It was understood that there was a chemical, there was some substance in cow urine that seemed to promote masculine qualities in people. I don't know how that was ever figured out, but sometimes it's best not to dig into those things too much. But it was known that there was a chemical in cow urine that had this, sort of, I don't know if the word might be androgenic. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but this sort of increasing the masculine qualities of a person's body, and the science of it wasn't developed, but they were aware of this fact that something in cow urine had this effect on the human body. And then as they started to study, they learned that there was a substance in the human testicles that was even more powerful in this way, and that's where ultimately testosterone came from. this substance. What happens in modern science is they try to isolate the effective substance. Usually, if you look at medications, you'll see active ingredient listed. There's usually an essential substance that's found to be the cause of the desired effect, and they try to isolate that substance, and then they try to find if there's a way to produce that substance artificially. That's sort of the jackpot, to be able to find out what exactly it is that causes the desired effect, and then to see if it can be produced artificially. And that's where this whole pharmaceutical industry comes from, and so on. So when you trace the history of these things, and then you go from the discovery of this first substance to the development and identification of what's called testosterone, and then you continue through this development until you finally get to the anabolic steroids, which are known today, which have these profound effects on the human body. But it's interesting to study the history of these things. And again, the reason why the history is important is because the ancients were familiar with many of these observations. They were familiar with many of these substances. They might not be able to isolate, the active ingredient, as it were. They may not be able to explain it at that level, but they knew that, with this example, like cow urine had this effect, and so they would work with cow urine. They knew that, they knew that animal manure, that cow manure, for example, improved the production of the crops. They didn't talk about it being nitrogen in the cow manure or anything like that. They didn't use modern terminology to talk about it, but they knew at the natural level, they knew that this substance produced this effect. And while our knowledge may be more exact than theirs, in actual practice, in the actual sustainable practice, much of what modern science and medicine does, that it takes credit for and boasts about, isn't actually sustainable or useful. So if you go and visit someone's farm today, that gardener or farmer may be able to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and these different acidity levels of the soil and all this technical scientific language. But when you come to the actual practice of sustainable gardening, you find men and women simply spreading manure in their gardens, just like they did in the ancient world. You find many of the same things. You find compost piles, and so on. You find farmers collecting the chicken manure out of their hen house and adding it to the compost pile and then spreading it in the garden throughout the year. So the ancient practices and the ancient ways of thinking remain the only sustainable way of doing these things. And much of what the modern sciences do, they reveal some things, but they're often unsustainable in the actual application and use. And so we go back to the ancient way to actually practice these things. So essentially, nothing is different at the practical level, even though in the theoretical level or in the academic level, there may be this appearance of greater knowledge, this greater accuracy or this exactness in modern knowledge. But when it's time to put that into work, that's usually useless. If you're a gardener, you know that you'll be told that you should contact your local co-op extension service, which is usually the agriculture department at the local state university, and they've got all kinds of state-funded stuff going on, and you know that very little of what they do actually applies to sustainable small-scale farming and gardening. And that's sort of the dilemma in modern society. We can talk about all these things and talk about all these exact measures and substances and isolate these specific chemicals and hormones and things like that. But really, what can we do with that knowledge? We really can't work with that knowledge. And so we often end up back in the ancient ways, and that's sort of how things work practically. But what I want to highlight there is that it seems that much of what the ancients did is still done today. We really don't know anything that they didn't know in an essential way, even though we may have a more exact knowledge of what specifically is the cause of the desired effect. In practice, it really doesn't matter. And this is what we find in modern science. There's an appearance of some kind of some greater knowledge. There's an appearance of some greater mastery of nature, but practically it doesn't really affect anything. And what we practice is largely the same. Now, this is seen most clearly in medicines where, for example, we'll talk about things like penicillin or amoxicillin or phenobarbital, like I mentioned before. We'll talk about all of these different medications, sometimes by their actual names, sometimes by brand names and things like that. We'll talk about Benadryl or, Ritalin and different drugs that are prescribed and so on. And we won't find those names in ancient literature, but if we look at the history of these different substances and medications, and we find where do these things actually come from, how are these things actually discovered, we'll find just a more organized, industrialized way of handling the things that the ancients handled by different means, but much of it is the same. So anyway, that's a point that I want to ask you to pay attention to. To not be distracted by the presentation of the substance in a tablet or in a capsule or in a syringe or in an IV bag or anything like that. I'd like you to think about these things and ask, what really is this substance? What is this substance? And how does it relate to what was known in the ancient world? And you may be completely unfamiliar with these studies, as I expect most people will be. But I'd like to share with you the sources and start to talk about these things and learn about these things together, because I've been studying these things for quite a long time. As I said, I was a pre-med student, so I was interested in natural sciences and medicine and healthcare, but then as my interests shifted to philosophy and theology, I stopped the pursuit of modern science and medicine and was immersed in ancient science and medicine. And now that I live on a farm and have access to gardens and have had all kinds of livestock and experience with animals, I've been able to get into a lot of this ancient natural philosophy and see the wisdom of it, especially at a sustainable, practical level. And I've learned that many times things that I read in ancient works on natural history that seem to be inaccurate or unreliable actually prove to be perfectly true. And it's our own bias and prejudice towards the ancients that causes us to react negatively and skeptically. But when we actually search it out, we find that they're absolutely right. And scientists will still say the same things today, but they'll say it in different ways, or things will simply take upon themselves different modes or ways of doing things. And that can be confusing. So a couple of areas where I'm really interested in, and I'd like to invite you to study and investigate with me. Number one, the use of modern drugs, whether they be prescription drugs or illegal drugs, right? Controlled substances, whatever you want to call them. And this starts with alcohol and goes on to any kind of smoking, whether it's tobacco or marijuana, the use of drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines, opioids, all of these drugs that are influencing our society invisibly. We normally, when you watch the news or read the news, we very rarely talk about the influence of alcohol and drugs in all of these different behaviors. But there's substance use and abuse behind many of the immoral behaviors that we're hearing about and seeing and talking about, and those things often go unmentioned. They're treated as separate issues. I'd like us to pay attention to the correlation between these things. For example, you'll find that if we look at, let's say, homosexual culture, you'll find that it's very rarely free from alcohol and drug abuse. And the question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did the drug abuse lead to, or the drug and alcohol abuse lead to the homosexuality, or did the homosexuality lead to the drug and alcohol abuse? Those are interesting questions to get into. I'd also like us to look at the relationship between the role of this modern scientist or physician as sort of a modern magician, or almost like a witch doctor, in that the way that the information is shared, even though it's presented in scientific language, there's no actual demonstration. And so what's actually happening is that the people are listening to what the witch doctor tells them. They have no evidence that this is true or false. They have no way to verify what they're told. They simply trust the witch doctor, as it were. They trust the scientist. They trust the physician. And it really comes to a point where it's religious, where they receive these things. They receive these prescriptions and recommendations by faith, by a blind trust in the men who prescribe them. I saw a story recently where there was a family who had twin sons born with a sexual problem, and there was an accident in the treatment of it, and one of the boys ended up losing his private parts, and the parents had no idea what to do. You can imagine what a horrific situation that would be. And so they went to a doctor who told them that they could simply raise that child as if he was a girl, and because gender is sort of a cultural or a social construct, they say, that as long as he was consistently raised as a girl from his early childhood, he would be a girl. And so they handed these children over to these physicians and just trusted what they said. And you look at that and you say, how can you do that? And you see it's just religious faith and just complete abandonment of the intellect to the so-called scientists and doctors. And it's the same thing that they'll criticize Christians for doing that with respect to God, but they'll do it to, they'll expect their patients to do it to them as the experts. And so it's very religious when you really get down to the actual relationship between the patient and the doctor, or the common person and the scientist. It really boils down to what's essentially a religious system of faith and obedience to the magic man who has this sort of divine knowledge that can't be shared. There's no way to, you're not allowed into the Holy of Holies, as it were. You're not allowed into the secret society. You can't see the secrets. You just stand outside in the court, as it were, and the priests of the modern science tell you what you must do. That's really what it's like, even though it's, like I said, it's presented differently. That's really what the relationship is like. And I want us to look at things like the origins of these different drugs that are used, the effects that they have. And another key issue that I want us to look at is and this is a personal thought that I have all the time that I just like to share and ask you to think about and comment on if you've ever had these thoughts. In the ancient world, if you know about the god Bacchus, how the Greeks and Romans thought about Bacchus or Dionysius, they understood that the power of alcohol they understood it to be actually the influence of the god, and so that the consumption of the alcohol wasn't the actual cause of the effect. It was sort of the means by which the god was invoked to influence our body and soul. So just think about it. If I offer some incense and say a prayer and I invoke the Holy Spirit, that process that I use for the invocation is understood to be the means, but the actual effect is attributed to the God himself. That's how the ancients looked at things like alcohol. They saw the effects of the wine on their minds and souls and bodies as the influence of the god. And the drinking of the wine was symbolic of, or I shouldn't say symbolic, it was almost sacramental, where the drinking of the wine was the act of invocation, where you were inviting with your free will, with your freedom, you were inviting the God or the Spirit. That's why alcoholic beverages are called spirits to this day. You were invoking the Spirit to come and have its effect in you. And so we can see that clearly in the use of fermented beverages, of alcoholic beverages. But we can see the same thing in all different areas as well in the ancient world. We can see them with the use of different substances like plants and different substances like stones or metals that were used for different remedies. They were never used by themselves in a materialistic way as if there was some kind of natural power inherent in the object. They were used with a religious belief or spell or incantation or prayer joined to them. And so it was this, it really had the characteristics of a sacramental practice where there would be a visible sign, but there would also be a spiritual reality that was represented by that visible sign, even present in that visible sign. And so it was always this combination of the substance, the material substance, and the spiritual reality. And the use of the substance was understood to be the means by which the divine influence was invoked. And so the action was the invocation. And I think we miss that when we talk about ancient medicine and practices like this, because we focus on the substances, we focus on the material things, but we ignore how the people who used them thought about them. So we often make their practices ridiculous, like we'll say, oh, well, they wear an amulet around their neck made of jasper stone, and they imagine that the jasper stone helps them to successfully bear children. And we sort of scoff at that ridiculousness. But they didn't believe it was the jasper stone. They didn't believe it was the jasper stone that did that. And just compare that idea to the idea that we Catholics have of holy water. If I go into my family room where we keep a container full of holy water, and I anoint myself with the holy water, I believe that something happens to me. I don't believe it. It's not water. I wouldn't do the same. I wouldn't go over to the tap and turn the faucet on and take some water and sign myself with it and believe that water has power in it. That's not what I believe. It's this specific water. And it's because this specific water has been invested with certain prayers and blessings. And it's this consecrated substance that I consider to have this power in it. Again, not an intrinsic power, but a power that's conferred upon it by the priests of the Catholic Church. And so we can see that, we as Catholics, we practice these things in sacraments and sacramentals and then we scoff at the ancients who practiced the same things. And I don't mean same exactly, because they did so in ignorance and without the actual grace of the sacraments themselves. But they had the same understanding that there was a sort of a supernatural use of natural things. And we see the truth of the sacraments and the sacramentals present in sort of this anticipation of the gospel in the religious and medicinal practices of the ancient magicians and sorcerers and religious leaders and so on. So it's very interesting where this use of a substance is an act of invocation, if that makes sense. And when it comes to modern drugs and medications and things like that, I often wonder if the use of a certain substance or the use of a certain medication is in itself an act whereby a person invokes a certain spirit or a certain spiritual influence, and the effects produced by that action are not necessarily to be attributed to the substance as much as to spiritual influences that those substances may bring about by means of this sort of symbolic invocation of those influences. Because I don't buy the materialistic explanation for, let's say, like what drugs do. So, for example, if a person smokes marijuana, is it really just exclusively the natural effect of smoking the marijuana that causes the effect, or is the smoking of marijuana an act of invocation whereby a person, by their own free will, invites this influence to enter into their body and soul, and what's produced is affected by the freedom with which they request it. So if a person does it in complete ignorance, it may not have its effect, or they may learn from one experience to never do that again, whereas another person who understands the effects and freely desires them, with understanding and intention, that's the person who really has the most profound effect or experience with that behavior, because it's a clear and free invocation of that effect or influence. So I wonder if there's not a spiritual aspect to this natural science that's simply being presented to us in a different way, but really the same thing is going on. As I said, the scientists and the doctors, for all of the talk about science, we're talking about science, but there's no actual scientific talk. There's talk about science, but no scientific talk. And what's actually going on, the transaction between the patient and the doctor, or the common person and the scientist, is almost a religious transaction, like that between a worshiper and a priest. When I go to confession, I rest in the sacrament of holy orders, and I trust that the priest who absolves my sins does so in the person of Christ. And you see, there's this, what I would call a religious transaction that takes place, where I submit myself to this priest through faith, and I anticipate receiving some spiritual blessing because of this relationship that I believe exists between this priest and God and this priest and me. And I think that what goes on in modern science and medicine is really the same thing. It's just that they would never admit that it's so, where I would admit that it's so in my religion, but I would never approach a scientist or a physician with that disposition. I would want scientific evidence. I would want scientific talk. I would not yield by faith to the scientist or the physician, because faith is ultimately owed to God alone. But I think that modern people do in fact live by faith in science and medicine, and it really is a religion that refuses to call itself a religion. And the effects of it are all claimed to be natural and materialistic, when in fact I would argue that they are not so. They are actually spiritual, and not truly spiritual, but deceivingly spiritual. So anyway, that's another issue that I'd like to explore, and I intend to explore in future talks. And I'd like us to compare things that we see in the ancient world with things around us that we see in the modern world. Where, for example, does this transgender stuff come from? Is this a spirit that's influencing people? Is the use of, let's say, psychotropic drugs actually having the effect of invoking certain spirits into the lives and souls of modern children, or adult men and women? Let's take the use of all of these drugs in schools, like Ritalin and Adderall. Are these things having long-term effects on students that have sort of a spiritual significance that affects their moral life and their mental state, their ability to reason and understand things as they should? Are there more significant consequences to these seemingly medicinal activities that we are really not respecting or taking seriously? Because it seems that things are getting crazy quickly, and if we look at all of these crazy movements and things, and we sort of trace them back to what might be their origin, we find that what these kids, what these adults have in common is a history of the use of these different substances in really sort of an undiscerning way, where they've just yielded to this medical community and they accept any suggestions, any diagnoses, any remedies that are proposed. They just submit to them and follow them with a spirit of obedience. And it really, like I said, it really is a new religion, or not a new religion, but a revived religion. But it's dressed up in different clothing. It's made to appear in different ways. The language is changed and so on. But really the parallels between what's being done and the effects, most importantly the effects, so clearly parallel the practices and effects of ancient religions and ancient magic and sorceries and all of this kind of stuff that I personally believe, and this is just my own personal opinion about this, I personally believe that this is a widespread delusion where an ancient religion and this ancient sorcery is simply being spread through the modern world in disguise. That's what I really believe, because it's very interesting to look back at the original languages. For example, if you look at the book of Revelation, I don't know where it is off the top of my head. I'll take a quick look, see if I can find it. I probably won't, though. I don't think I know it off the top of my head. But if we look in the book of Revelation, there's no way that I'm going to find it quickly like this. But we read about how the wicked are banished from the kingdom of God, and they're cast out into the lake of fire, as it were, the second death, for eternal destruction. And it talks about how the people are cast into this punishment, and included among them are sorcerers. And we've got this word sorcerers in the book of Revelation. I can't find it right now. But anyway, in the book of Revelation. You can find it with a quick Bible search online. But the word sorceries, that's translated sorceries in Greek, is pharmakeia, which is where our English word pharmacy or pharmaceutical is derived from. It's just bizarre. We would never refer to modern pharmaceuticals or the pharmacy as a source of sorcery or anything like that, and yet the word itself is derived from that Greek word. And I know that doesn't prove anything, but it's just bizarre. You think that if sacred scripture warned that this thing was one of the practices that merited condemnation, you would think that you would stay away from that thing. I wouldn't think that I would then take that word and then say, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're going to call it this because in ignorance. I don't. How can that even happen? The fact that word is at the center of everything that we see going on in our society, I don't think that that's accidental. And again, I'm not presenting that as some kind of demonstration or proof. I'm just saying that the fact of that, it can't be coincidental. And I think we should investigate it a little bit to try to discern exactly what's going on. So anyway, I've presented some questions or issues that I would like to explore in coming months. And, as I said before, I don't have the answers to these things. These are things that I'm interested in exploring and discussing and studying and so on. And I'd like to invite you to join me in this study and in these discussions because there's no way to make sense of what's going on around us when you simply, accept what modern science tells you about itself. That the effects of it are evil, and they're visibly evil. They're manifestly evil. And yet we just continue to give the benefit of the doubt and trust and yield and obey and comply and offer this religious obedience and reverence to these scientists and physicians, and we watch and see that the fruits they're producing throughout our society are evil and inexplicably evil. And I think it's time for us to start to, not just question these things, because I think most people do question these things, but to really try to dig and search for explanations and proof of what's actually going on and why the effects are what they are. And I think we'll find that there's a direct relationship between ancient religion and magic, as it was called, and sorceries and things like that. I think we're going to find a direct correlation between what was practiced in pre-Christian and anti-Christian cultures with what's going on around us today, but it's all presented in nice, white, clean, lab coats, and it's made to look innocent, and they don't invoke the names of gods and things like that. They don't present things in religious language or in religious appearance, but really, when we reflect on what's going on, that's what's actually going on around us. There's a religion being installed in our society, and we're being commanded to submit and yield, just as Daniel was commanded to yield to the golden image of Babylon in the ancient world. We're being told that we have to yield to this authoritative priesthood of knowledge and information. We have to yield with religious observance. And if we don't, we deserve to be punished for it. And I feel like most Christians even though they fuss superficially when they're told to do something they don't like. If you just listen to the way that we talk about these things, we talk about these things with a religious devotion to them, yielding to them by faith, talking about things we have absolutely no proof of. And yet we talk about them as if we know them to be true. And that's what faith is. It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I just wanted to share these things to invite you to discuss them with me, think about them. I'd like to know your thoughts. If you have studied them or if you have learned about them, what have you learned? What have you studied or read or thought? What have your experiences been? I'd like to know, because I'm very interested in these things, and I think they're serious. I think they're having serious effects in our lives, and we're not discerning these effects or their causes. And it's like living in a house with poison gas leaking. Everyone's sick, and no one's aware of the fact that the house is filled with this poisonous gas. I'd like us to take the effects of these things seriously and to consider what the causes really are, because there's no natural explanation for what's going on around us. So anyway, I hope that's helpful to get some thoughts moving and discussions started, and I plan on talking about these things in detail in coming months. So if you'd like to get into these things with me, please keep an eye on YouTube videos being posted, and I'll try to make sure that notices go out when I do. God bless.